And welcome back to the All About Photography podcast, where we discuss anything and everything photography related, with a new episode coming live every Monday midnight at Greenwich Mean Time. Depending on where you are in the world, depends on what time it may be coming out live to you in your local timing. You can find us on all of your favorite podcasting platforms, Spotify, Amazon, Apple Podcasts, as well as the video podcast on YouTube, coming onto the Pien VC Photography YouTube channel. So for those of you watching on YouTube, hello. Pien, learn to stop hitting the mic, please, because that's going to help everybody out. Now, this week has been a little bit of an exciting week in the camera world because Sony has just released a new camera. Now, I'm not going to be talking about their ZV-E10 thingamabobby that they've said has been designed for vloggers, because looking at the specs, I don't see exactly how it is designed for vloggers, with the widest being a 20mm equivalent, but I digress. Have to make sure I don't go off on too many tangents today, but instead I'm going to talk about their new A7R5, which I have been quite curious to see, I'll admit, because the A7R4 was an absolutely huge step up over the A7R3, but there isn't that much of a step up from the A7R4 to the A7R5 in my opinion, which we'll go into later on. So go over the specs of the A7R5 first, and then my thoughts on it in terms of whether it's a decent upgrade compared to the A7R4, and then whether or not you should get it and who it would be applicable to, but also if it's not applicable to you, like what alternatives you can get. And when I say not applicable, I mean like it wouldn't be the best option for you to go and purchase, depending on the type of photography that it is you like to do. Now, as we all know, the A7R5 is the successor to their A7R4, which came out roughly 2 years ago, or just a little bit before that. As we all know, the world has been hit by COVID and pretty much put on hold for 2 years. So it's great to see that Sony is still making and producing and releasing new cameras, regardless of everything that's been going on. Specs-wise, for the A7R5, should I just come up with a new nickname for it instead of going A7R5, A7R5? It's such a tongue twister and such a long thing to say. Whereas if you get like Nikon, you've got like Z9, Canon, R5, Sony, A7R5. I'm just going to call it I'm not going to call it the R5 because Canon has an R5. Anyway, another stupid tangent that we shouldn't have gone down, but that's my fault, not yours, and I do apologize for that, and thank you for listening. The main photo specs that most people are concerned about when it comes to nearly any camera nowadays is the megapixels. Has it got in-body stabilization? What's the ISO? And how many frames per second can it take? So as this is actually the same sensor that they used in the A7R4, it is their 61 megapixel sensor, but they do have the new processor behind it though. So that does mean that it does process images slightly differently compared to before. And it does have a similar ISO range of the native ISO range, at least being 100 to 32,000. I'm sure they can bump it up if they want to, but for whatever reason they haven't. And naturally, you can extend the ISO even higher if you want to, and also go even lower down to 50 ISO instead of ISO 100 if you so choose. But the advice I've always seen is that if you stick to the native range, your images will be a lot cleaner and clearer. So if you can do so, I sometimes need to remember that piece of advice, because I will often drop my ISO down to 50 on my Canon when I'm taking images if I can, or if I do it on purpose just so I can extend the shutter speed. But they always say stick to the native ISO as best you can, because that's probably best. That's what the camera does best. And as for the frame rate, your mechanical shutter has got 10 frames per second, which isn't great, but isn't bad. But you also do have to remember that it is a 61 megapixel sensor. So if you are shooting lossless, uncompressed RAW, you're actually getting 120 megapixel images out of each picture. And regardless of which SD card you're using, which the SD cards we'll get to in a second, that is a lot of data to process. So even 10 frames per second isn't too bad if you're shooting that high. And then for some reason with the electronic, you've got 7 frames per second. I would have thought it would be quicker because there's no actual mechanical shutter that has to move, but that's just me. I don't completely understand why. Maybe someone can tell me exactly why it is. The electronic shutter is not as fast as the mechanical shutter. It could possibly be down to the processing. I genuinely have no idea. I probably should do more research into that, but either way. Now, one amazing upgrade that it has come out with, which applies to both the photo and the video side of it, is that it's got 8 stops of in-body stabilization. And that's the camera alone. That's not in conjunction with another lens. So if you put a lens on there that's got a further 1.5 stops of stabilization, that's 9.5 stops you've got. That is insanely long. Having that option available to you is absolutely amazing because, as I've preached many times in not just this podcast, but also my own videos, that my Canon EOS R currently has 0 stabilization, that I have to rely on the lenses for it. The fact that they're now releasing cameras with 8 stops is insane. That means that if you wanted to do a slightly longer exposure, if you can hold that camera relatively stable, you aren't going to get any camera shake, no matter who you are, which is great to see because I've seen images with just 5 stops of stabilization, and I have to admit, I'm quite envious. I wish I could do it, but I know that I can't unless I'm using a tripod. But video specs wise, it does have the 4K 60 frames per second, but there is a slight 1.2 factor crop to bear in mind. It can do 8K 25 frames per second as well as your 24 frames per second and what is the true one, that 23.976 or something like that. But either way, you can film in 8K if you so choose. And then if you wanted to do 120 frames per second for really slow motion stuff, then you have to film that in HD because that's just not available in 4K yet. I know, is it the I think it's the A7RV where you can do 4K 120 FPS, but if I'm wrong, please feel free to let me know. But I think that's the only Sony camera right now that lets you do that. I don't often film in 120 FPS purely because none of the cameras I've got offer it except my GoPro, but then that drops down the quality to 720, which is even worse. Which, even though it's only for social media, I'd still rather not film in low quality than have to worry about rendering it in high quality because that often doesn't look as good. Right now, 120 FPS, if you really need it, this camera may not be for you, but at the same time, you wouldn't buy this camera if it's just for video purposes only anyway. You'd go their A7S3, the FX3, or their newly released FX30. We're not going to talk about those cameras today because the S3, the FX3, and the FX30 are more video-centric cameras more than photo cameras. And this is a photo podcast, not a video podcast. Now, ports-wise, they do have dual memory card slot, which is always great to have. I've personally never had it be an issue for me, but for those of you who do need to have the redundancy, it's always great to have dual card slots, and they can accommodate either CF Express Type A or UHS Type 2 cards, which, if you factor in that you're shooting a 61 megapixel sensor, you do need at least a UHS Type 2, but a CF Express A would be preferable because of just how fast they are. They are significantly faster compared to even a UHS 2. If you're going to go with a UHS 1, you will not be able to utilize that 10 frames per second for long at all, purely because the memory card cannot process it fast enough, and it all depends on the buffer that the camera has as well. That's a whole technical discussion that we can save for another episode if you want to know more about it. You do get a full HDMI port, which is good because I have had to worry about finding a cable to use the mini HDMI port, and it's not hard to get, but it's annoying that you have to go out and get it. So the fact that you have full HDMI does make things a bit easier, and you've got your USB-C, which you can use for data transfer, charging the batteries, and whatnot whilst you're using it as well. But another big upgrade it's got, which I know a lot of people have been harping on about, and I'll be the first to admit I'm one of them, is that it now finally has a fully articulating LCD touchscreen, which, honestly, it's about time. Every other camera brand I know, unless you get their, absolute entry-level cameras, have a fully articulating touchscreen. My first Nikon D6600 had an articulating touchscreen. My Canon EOS R has an articulating touchscreen. The number of times that it comes in handy where you can rotate that LCD screen to check to make sure your angles are right when you're trying to take a picture versus just one that flips up and down is a lifesaver. Because even if you're just taking a quick snap but you want to get down low or you have to get up high, the fact that you can rotate that screen to whatever angle you need so you can make sure that you've got it lined up properly is a time saver and a lifesaver, because that way at least you know you've got a much better chance of walking out with the shot you want versus taking the picture, hoping you got it, realize you don't, try again, or lay down on the ground or whatever it is you have to do to try to get the image versus being able to just kneel down a little bit, rotate that screen the way you need to, and fire away. And the price tag for the A7R5 isn't too bad either. When you factor in exactly what you're getting out of this at just under $4,000 is actually pretty good. You're getting a 61 megapixel camera that can shoot 8K 25 frames a second, 4K 60, dual card slots, full HDMI, 8 stops in body stabilization, and that fully articulating screen. It's actually a pretty sweet deal that you're walking away with. because there's not that many other cameras that can compete with that just on the megapixel spec wise for the same price range. And the ones with lower megapixels but higher frames per second often cost a lot more as well. That's the specs of the A7R5. Not a huge upgrade over the A7R4, granted. Right, it's not as much of an upgrade as the A7R3 was, where that went from 45 megapixels to 60. This one is still the same sensor, that's why it's still 61 megapixels. But one of the biggest upgrades I know that they've talked about is their new autofocusing system on there, which for me as a landscape and sometimes portrait and cityscape photographer is not so much a concern because I'm not really tracking objects. But if you do photojournalism or sports or weddings, being able to track your subjects as they're moving around is something you always worry about because you want to make sure you've always got your subject in focus when you're getting the shot. So having that autofocusing system that tracks your subjects a lot better, even if it can't always find the eye, but it can stay on the head or on the body of the person, and you have a much better chance of getting the image sharp the way you want it, I know that's going to be a huge factor for a lot of photographers out there who do need accurate autofocus tracking capabilities in the cameras that they're using. Now, it does have the same body as the A7R4, so that's a good thing because I know the previous A7 series, whether it's the A7 II or the R2 or the RS2, that a lot of people said, or even the A7 III for that matter, everyone was saying the bodies were too small and they didn't like it because it just felt too flimsy. They couldn't get a proper grip. But I know in the recent iterations of the cameras, their crop sensor cameras aside at least, that the bodies have felt a lot easier to hold and a lot more natural compared to previous generations. So if you've already got an A7R4 or even an A7 IV for that matter, you already know how this camera feels in your hands. But at the end of the day, everybody's always going to ask, should I go ahead and buy this camera? And like many things, there are just too many factors to consider and too many variables to consider that it's not just a clear-cut yes or no. Because if we just take a professional who does this for a living versus a hobbyist, which we'll get into next, and that is a professional who, let's say you've already got an A7R4, and you know that you can recoup the investment of an A7R5 relatively easily, then I'd say why not? Because you get that new autofocusing feature, which if that's something that's really important to you, you know that it will make your life a lot easier and you'll have less concern about missing the shots because of the fact the camera has focused. And so that will be a benefit. And then you can either sell your A7R4 or keep it as a backup for whatever reason in case something happens to your A7R5, which, touch wood, fingers crossed, nothing ever does because nobody wants anything to happen to their main cameras. Or if you're just want it just purely for the autofocusing feature, then I would say if you're a professional, yes, why not? Because like I just said though, it's making sure that more often than not, you will get the shot you want because the camera's focusing where you want versus not. And so that means you spend less time culling through images that aren't in focus, and you have less stress because you know that whenever you wanted to get the shot, you were always able to get the shot because you were focused properly. And at the same time, if you are a professional who's already invested in the Sony system, like you've got one of their cameras and a few of their lenses, or lenses that are compatible with a Sony E-mount, and you wanted to print larger, then yes, I would say that this would be a solid upgrade because don't forget, it is a 61 megapixel sensor. So the amount of raw data that you're getting out of there and the size that you can print compared to my Canon EOS R at 30 is a significant difference. Or even Sony's A7R4 at 33 megapixels is a significant difference. All right, I've worked on images that came out of a Leica SL2, which is a 45 megapixel sensor, and the amount of detail in that compared to my EOS R at 30 is significant. You do notice it. So if you are a professional that wants to be able to do larger prints and you're already invested in the Sony system, then yes, it is something that should be worth considered because you can start printing larger if that is something your business needs from you to start doing moving forward. If you don't need to print large, then it may not be that much of a decent upgrade financially speaking, because what do you actually need that 61 megapixel sensor for then if you are not printing large? And that autofocusing system will benefit a lot of genres. It'll benefit your sports photographers who need to track players on the field and whatever sport it is they're doing. It'll benefit wedding photographers when they're taking pictures of the couple dancing or moving around or whatever the case is, to make sure that whoever they're taking a picture of is in focus. It'll also help with photojournalism to make sure the subject they're taking pictures of in focus. So there's lots of photography genres where this can come in handy. There's even wildlife and bird photography where it will come in focus because it's now got IAF for all sorts of different animals out there that you can choose from. So if you do take wildlife, but you don't need a high frame rate, but you want to print big, then yes, it may be a decent upgrade for you because it's got that animal tracking option where I think I saw like bird AI on part of the specs or something like that. But if you're a hobbyist and you're not invested in any system yet, right? You're thinking of investing into a system, you've got a kit camera, whatever the case is, this would be a big investment for your first full frame camera. All right, and as we all say in photography, in the photography world, it's glass, 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 which means make sure you invest in lenses more so than the camera body itself. All right, if you take an amazing camera body like the A7R5 or their A1, but you chuck on a kit lens, the images will not look as good than if you took the A7 IV and put a high quality lens in front of it. Granted, the A7 IV has got half the megapixels, but the image is going to look sharper because you've put a better lens in front of the camera. All right, so unless you've got the funds where you can buy this camera as well as professional lenses, I would say maybe don't get this one and invest in lenses first, and then get something like the A7 IV and see if it's really worth it before you upgrade to the A7R5, and then see what you can do. But if you're not invested in the Sony system yet and you're just a hobbyist who takes pictures on holiday, this may be a huge step up and a huge investment for you to factor in. If, on the other hand, you are a hobbyist but you're thinking of making this a side gig to eventually go professional, then I can understand why you would want to invest in this particular camera body. But make sure that you've got the quality lenses to go along with it, because otherwise you are shortchanging yourself by having an amazing camera body with amazing specs, but not the glass to go along with it. But there are cases where this camera may not be a great upgrade for you. And this is specifically for those photographers who need a high frame rate. And that's where 10 frames a second simply will not suffice because they need a faster frame rate because of the action photos that they're trying to take. And these are the ones I mentioned earlier, which are your wildlife photographers, your sports photographers. They often require to be able to take anywhere up to 20 frames per second comfortably as they're tracking an object as it's moving quickly, because they don't want to have to take 10 seconds, wait for the camera to buffer all of the images, get that buffer free, and then take again and risk missing the shot. So if it is a case where 10 frames a second just simply isn't fast enough for you, then you may have to consider other camera bodies instead. And if you're looking at Sony only, because you're invested in the Sony system already, maybe consider the A1 or the A9 II, because they respectively have 20 frames per second each. The only difference is the A1 is a 50 megapixel sensor, whilst the A9 II is 24. If you're looking at other brands, with Nikon, you've got the Z9, although that is their flagship camera, so that does cost a significant amount more compared to the A7R5. But then you've also got Canon's full-frame mirrorless cameras to look at. You've got the R3, the R5, and the R6 that all shoot 20 frames per second or above. And unless you're printing large, any of those cameras will be able to do the job for you because of the fact that it's shooting 20 frames a second. Well, the R3 actually shoots at 30 frames a second, but that's... Canon say it's not their flagship camera, but it's pretty much like a flagship camera. It looks almost like their 1DX Mark III and feels like it and has pretty much the same specs. It's just it's got a 24 megapixel sensor instead of 20. So any of those cameras, if you needed a high frame rate to be able to take the photos you do for wildlife and sports photography, I think would be a better option over the A7R5. Because you don't have as high of a megapixel, you don't have to worry about the buffer getting filled up as fast and then the data being saved onto the memory cards before you can go again. You have a much better chance of getting the images you need and not having to worry about missing it because of that buffering factor. Because as I mentioned earlier, you're using a 61 megapixel sensor, which if you shoot an uncompressed RAW comes out at 120 megapixels. At the speed that your memory card can write at depends how many pictures you will take before it's saved in the camera buffer, which will then be filled up and which you will then have to wait to be cleared before you can start taking pictures again. Whereas if you shoot in any of those other camera bodies I mentioned, first of all, you'll be able to write to those memory cards faster, whether it's UHS-2 or CF Express Type A is irrelevant, but also the buffer won't fill up as quickly. It just might take a little bit longer to clear, or the same time depending on the actual camera that you're using. So if you do need a high frame rate and you need to be able to capture the action quickly and not worry about the buffer, then yes, maybe the A7R5 isn't the best option for you, and I would advise going elsewhere. But as I've mentioned before, though, it's completely up to you. Lastly, if you don't have a Sony yet, you're not invested in the Sony system at all, in any way, shape, or form, you use, like my first camera was a Nikon D6600 that came with a kit lens, and I just got another kit lens because it wasn't expensive and I wanted to make sure it's something I actually wanted to do. Then you don't go for the Sony straight off the bat. Look at every other brand out there. Check everything else that it's got to offer, not just how many megapixels the sensor has. See what lenses are available to you. See what other reviewers have said about that particular camera, or even previous generations that are still very good to use. Like if you're a little bit budget conscious, don't get the A7R5. Go for the A7R4 or the A7 IV. Because those are, well, the A7 R4 will probably drop in price now, but the A7 IV is significantly cheaper than the A7R5 or even the A7R4 for that matter. The main reason I would say go with Sony over Canon and Nikon is purely because of lens selection. That is the main reason behind it. Canon lenses are great, yes, don't get me wrong. Nikon lenses are great too. Where did I get Noki from? But at the same time, there just aren't as many lenses available to Canon and Nikon's mirrorless systems as there is to Sony. Maybe there will be one day, maybe there won't be. Unless you've got the DeLorean from Back to the Future, nobody's going to know for sure. But if you're concerned about the lens choices right now at this point in time, then yes, go Sony. If not, start hunting and see what else is there and factor everything in, not just the price of the body, but the price of the lenses that you want, and then see which one you like best. And that's the best advice I can give you if you're not invested into the Sony system yet and you're thinking of getting this camera or any camera for that matter. The lenses will determine which system you should go with, not the camera body. That's my thoughts on the A7R5. It looks like an amazing camera, don't get me wrong. And if I was invested or had the funds to invest into the Sony system, I would. But right now, I'm still with the Canon system. I may swap over. We have to wait and see how things pan out. I'm working on a few things that may affect that, but it's just a case of wait and see. If I was going to start all over again, then maybe I would reconsider and go with the Sony system just because of the lenses available, not because of the A7R5. But if you are invested in the Sony system and you are a professional who does this for a living and 10 frames a second isn't an issue to you, then this is an amazing camera to get. All right, that autofocus, the articulating touchscreen, the 8 stops of in-body stabilization. I mean, come on, who would say no to that? Whether you do photos or videos, that's an amazing thing to have. Imagine if you can do a 1-second image handheld without needing to worry about a tripod. How much easier would your life be at that point? I actually saw it on a video this week. They hate using a tripod because just making small changes is so cumbersome compared to handheld. And you know what? He's right. I completely support what he says. I just use a tripod all the time because I can do 10, 20, 30-second exposures, which I can't do handheld. But it is cumbersome to just change the tiniest thing. All right, so should you get the A7R5? It's up to you. It depends on your current situation. It depends on what you want your future situation to be. It depends on your financial situation. There's too many things to factor in. All right, would I get it if I could? Absolutely. If you gave me a credit card and said, here, go buy the A7R5, I'd be gone in a second buying it, but I wouldn't think twice. That's my thoughts on the camera. What do you think? Am I completely right or wrong in my opinions as to whether it's a good upgrade or not? If I'm wrong, please let me know why. I'd love to hear from you as always. If it's on any of the podcasting platforms, leave a review as to why I'm wrong. If it's on the YouTube video, leave a comment down below as to why you think I'm wrong on this particular camera as well. If I am wrong, I'd love to know why, and then I can learn from it, and anyone else who watches can learn from it as well. That's the great thing about the YouTube comment section is everybody can learn something if we all provide a good reason as to why I'm either right or wrong. And whilst you're at it, if you could give us a follow on your favorite platform, that would be greatly appreciated as well. And if you do want to leave a review, I do read them and I do take on board any constructive criticism that could help this podcast out, because at the end of the day, this is about me sharing my knowledge and opinions to try and help you become better photographers. That's the main reason I do this, is to share my knowledge with you so that you get the information you need quickly and succinctly instead of having to troll through who knows how many videos or podcasts or information out there. I hope that I can give you the information quickly, concisely, and accurately so that you can benefit from it the best. And don't forget, a new episode comes out live midnight Greenwich Mean Time every Monday on the major podcast streaming platforms as well as on the YouTube channel Pien VC Photography. I do thank you for listening to this episode. I do realize I spoke a little bit quickly, and if it was a bit too quick, I do apologize for that, but it is a very exciting camera that I really do wish I could go in and get right now. I just can't. All right, but I'll leave it there for now before I ramble on in too many different directions. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you for next week. And for the YouTube audience that have been watching, have a good one. I'll see you later. Bye for now.